Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. In today's episode, we're going to look at a different way the Romans conquered much of Italy and the wider Mediterranean, and that is through colonization. The Romans didn't simply conquer every single piece of land that they would eventually come to own, but much of it was actually acquired by sending out settlers to establish new towns and communities throughout the Italian peninsula. This wasn't actually anything new for the ancient world, and the Greeks did something similar for centuries. But in typical Roman fashion, they streamlined the whole process with a certain sense of organization and planning. So let's take a look at how all of this came about and how Roman colonization shaped much of the Mediterranean world for thousands of years to come. I think it could be helpful to first look at Greek colonization to provide us with a good departure point for analyzing how Roman colonization worked. Greek colonies were typically established at the whim of individual city-states, and it wasn't a process of some concerted, top-down effort by the Greeks or some sort of overarching Greek plan to occupy territory or land. Typically, these colonies were sent out when a city-state was starting to get overpopulated, and it was basically planned and organized by a leading group of citizens on their own accord. Essentially, Greek colonies were a private enterprise undertaken by a group of people looking for access to better land and resources. These people basically said, "Hey, things are starting to get a bit crowded here. Let's get some people together and build a new town somewhere else." Now, that's of course a bit of a simplification, but it is generally how it all went. Believe it or not, there appears to have still been quite a bit of unpopulated land in the ancient world that was there for the taking, so it appears to have been a fairly common practice to send out colonies for many different Greek city-states as a way to deal with overpopulation. That's a very rough overview, but it does provide the basic picture for how Greek colonies in the ancient world worked. Roman colonies worked very different. Opposingly, these were most often government-planned settlements, and they were planned and executed specifically with strategic, military, and political considerations in mind. This was a way for Rome to consolidate and control territory that lay on the periphery of their borders, and Roman colonization represents a concerted effort by the Romans to continually extend their territory, and even to hem in their neighbors. Additionally, when Rome did conquer a region militarily, and that region was considered to still be hostile and not completely safe, they would establish colonies there as well as a safer method of gaining control of that area. Because colonies were most often founded in distant and hostile, or at the very least unfriendly, territory, the settlers typically built a wall around the town, and the people often formed a sort of citizen-soldier colony to help protect themselves. So let's take a look at how these colonies were founded, and what specific mechanisms the Romans used to plan and manage them. The Latin word for these communities was colonia, and this word generally related to a group of farmers or cultivators. But when it was used in a technical sense by the Roman government, it did specifically refer to a group of settlers established by the Roman state. This establishment was achieved through a formal ceremony called the deductio, which was a set of rituals, sacrifices, and oaths that would be taken before the colony set out, and then once again after they arrived to the actual location of the new colony. This ceremony of the deductio was viewed as being both a legal and a symbolic establishment for the new community, and it was done to curry favor with the gods while also promising continued loyalty to Rome. So, while the Greek colonies were planned by private citizens looking for new opportunities, Roman colonies all began with official government planning and with the official ceremony of the deductio. After this, a formal three-man commission was established by the Senate, and these 3 men were charged with supervising all aspects of the colony's founding. Their typical duties involved assigning the territorial boundaries of the colony, assigning individual land allotments to settlers, adjudicating any disputes that might break out between settlers, and also establishing local laws for the colony. This commission was elected in the tribal assembly, and they were typically decreed to serve for a 3-year period. Now, the Roman government also issued them with a full support staff, equipment, transportation, clothing, and any money they might need to carry out their duties. The men in this commission were also granted imperium to conduct these tasks, giving them full legal authority to make any kind of decision they needed to, even those surrounding life and death. However, they were not given the full breadth of imperium that a proper Roman magistrate possessed. The type granted to this 3-man commission was called Imperium Extraordinarium, and their power was specifically limited to the territory of the new colony and in only making decisions related to the establishment of the colony. Now, once the colony was finally established, or once their 3-year tenure ended, their imperium was considered lapsed, and these 3 men would return back to Rome. To establish the actual physical boundary of the colony, and also to mark out plots of land for the individual settlers that were embarking on the colony, the area of land was formally surveyed using an instrument called a gramma. This was a special surveying tool used extensively by the Romans for a few different purposes, although it is unclear who first invented this specific device. The Greeks used a somewhat similar device called a dioptra for surveying, so it is quite likely that Roman surveying generally evolved from Greek knowledge and practices, as did so many things for the Romans. It's probably a bit complicated for me to outline how the gramma worked here by talking it all out in the podcast, but you can absolutely Google an image of a gramma or even watch a video on YouTube to see how it all worked, and I would definitely recommend you do that if you're curious. At any rate, the gramma was the tool the Romans used, and it allowed them to take precise measurements and plot out the land in an organized and calculated way. Most often, the Romans simply marked out land in a square checkerboard style pattern, although this could differ depending on the specific area. If the colony was on a hill, or if there were other obstructions in the area, the surveyors obviously had to work around that. Based on archaeology, we do know of colonies that had land plotted out in non-perfect squares, in rectangles, or in general strips of land. However, the majority of our archaeological evidence from Roman colonies does show that standard squares were the overall norm, and no matter what shape the Romans did end up using, it was always standardized and methodically planned out. The territory was first marked out into a Roman unit used to measure larger chunks of land, called a century. In the early Republic, a century was typically comprised of 200 jugera, which was Rome's smaller and more practical measurement of land. The actual sizes of these measurements of land varied over time from the Republic to the Empire, but in the period that we are looking at, which is again the early Republic, a century was about 125 modern acres, so really quite a big chunk of land, while a jugerum was about half of a modern acre. The Romans established their measurement of a jugerum by saying that it was the amount of land 2 oxen could plow in a single day, and it was their standard, most common, everyday figure for land size, like our use of acreage. So once the Roman surveyors first marked out the land into centuries, they then divided it into jugera. Afterwards, it could finally be divvied out to the new colonists. The specific plots of land were handed out to the colonists by a simple lottery, where settlers would write their name on a stone, and then these names would be pulled out of an urn, clay jar, or basket, or whatever else they had lying around. The actual amount of land a colonist could receive varied based on a whole lot of factors, and some of which we'll be going into as we continue on. But for the Roman citizen colonies in the early Republic, the standard allotment was 2 jugera, which was just about over 1 acre in modern terms. So, if a Roman citizen was embarking on a new colony during this period, they could expect to receive about 1 acre of land for free from the government. They would typically build a single-story dwelling on this land, and they might have a small food plot there as well. But often, there was also communal land used for farming outside of the main town area. The final grid distribution and allotments were engraved on bronze tablets to keep a formal record, and the limits were all marked out by physical boundary stones. When doing the surveying, the Romans also left some extra space in between the boundary lines, or property lines as we might call them, for some roads. These roads were all set up during the initial surveying so as to make sure the colony had a logical and practical system in place. Because most colonies were set up in a square checkerboard style, the center of the entire grid typically had a main intersecting road, one that typically crossed in a north-south, east-west fashion. Now, this wasn't always perfectly in the center of the colony, and it wasn't always perfectly north, south, east, west, but generally this was the pattern, and most colonies at least come close to this idea. The main road which ran east-west was called the Decumanus Maximus, and the main north-south road was called the Cardo Maximus. These two main roads were typically made to be 40 feet wide, and that is in modern feet, which means this road was close to the same size of a modern 2-lane road in the US when including the shoulders and a median. This main intersection served as the colony's chief reference point, and all of the streets within the colony were numbered in relation to this main intersection. So that's the rough overview of the colony itself. But what about how the Romans decided where to place these colonies? Throughout the early Republic, colonies were typically military and defensive in nature, and they would be sent out to occupy hills and choke points in strategic locations. Now, when I was learning about all of this, I kept thinking of the game Civilizations, if you've ever played that, and how, when I play, I'm always trying to send out settlers to occupy points on the map that have good resources or could serve as a good choke point, and it seems the Romans were doing much of the same thing here. The establishment of these colonies by the Romans eventually came to a head with the Samnites and was what really started all of Rome's wars with them. The Romans had been establishing colonies along the territory close to the Samnites in a specific attempt to block them from further expansion, and two colonies in particular really angered the Samnites. A colony was established at Cales in 334 BC, which was in the region of Campania near the city of Capua. This was done at a strategically important site, as it was established on a spot that had a wide command of the surrounding region. This angered the Samnites as they believed the Romans were becoming far too provocative with their colonies. It all came to a head after the Romans established another colony nearby at Fregellae in 328 BC, and it must be said that the placement of Fregellae did indeed encroach on the Samnites' proper borders, and it even violated a treaty that the Romans had already signed with the Samnites. Because of these two colonies, the Samnites eventually declared war in 326 BC, which would be the beginning of the Great Samnite War. If you remember back to my previous episode, the Romans lost the initial stages of this war, particularly at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321, and they were actually forced to dismantle the colonies at Cales and Fregellae as a result. However, once Rome started to turn things around, they would go on to re-establish these. Overall, my point here is that Roman colonies in the early Republic were absolutely situated in places that held strict military and strategic considerations, and they were a tool used by Rome to expand her influence, extend her borders, project her military power further, and hem in her neighbors. Roman colonies were definitely orchestrated in a highly planned and methodical fashion. Everything was set forth by the Roman government, from the beginning idea to create a new colony, to the election of the three-man commission and the deductio ceremony, to the actual funding and planning of the colony, and finally, to the formal mapping out of the colony's borders and territory. This is, again, in contrast to previous Greek colonies seen in the Mediterranean, which are basically formed ad hoc by private citizens. So let's take a look at a real, specific Roman colony, one that has been heavily excavated by archaeologists, as this can provide us with some real-life examples of everything I've talked about so far. And that is, of course, the Roman colony at Cosa. Cosa was founded in 273 BC on the coast of central Etruria, about 85 miles northwest of Rome, and today it's just under a 2-hour drive from there. This specific location had almost no human habitation before it was founded under the Republic, so it offered a blank slate for the town planners. It was situated on top of a hill along the sea coast, and the plan for creating this colony came about after the Romans defeated the nearby Etruscans of the Volcae. So, Cosa was founded to help occupy this territory and to begin Romanizing it. Now, because the colony planners considered it to be in somewhat hostile territory, the town had some impressive fortifications. It had a wall that was 30 feet high, 6 feet thick, had ramparts on top, and ran for almost a mile around the main town. There were 17 towers built along the wall, which projected 12 feet beyond the outer face. The town also had 3 fortified gateways and 3 main roads which ran from each of those gateways, as well as a palmario road which ran along the inside length of the wall. Cosa also had a prominent harbor built along the nearby coast, and the colony was a main hub for trade in the north for quite some time. Analyzing the actual space of the colony inside the walls based on archaeological findings, 25% of the town space was occupied by 2 large temples and the central forum, which would have all served as the main place for the colony's inhabitants to meet for markets and trade, to meet for religious festivals and ceremonies, as well as where their local government would have met. The streets occupied another 15% of the overall space in the colony. This leaves us with the remaining 60%, which was occupied by personal, single-story dwellings, which were mostly made from mortared masonry, and these completely filled the rest of the town. Now, the total space of the colony at Cosa was only about 33 modern acres, so it wasn't a very large town, and most of the people of the colony would have lived outside of the walls. Overall, it's believed that about 4,000 people joined the initial settlement of Cosa, so most of these would have lived in the surrounding countryside and could have taken refuge within the colony walls if trouble threatened them. From a historical perspective, Cosa offers the first instance of such heavy fortifications seen in a Roman colony, and the walls at Cosa remain the best preserved structure at the site. Today, Cosa hosts a museum where you can view a whole bunch of information and artifacts collected from the archaeological digging, and you can also visit and walk along the actual archaeological site as well. From here, let's look at the different statuses and levels that a colony could have. Because there wasn't just one type of colony the Romans founded, but there were actually multiple different types, where each one could have different levels of rights, land allotments, and even citizenship. When the Roman government set about establishing a colony, they didn't just determine where it would be located and who the 3-man commission would be, they also established how much land the settlers were going to receive, how much tax they might have to pay, whether or not they were subject to a military draft, and what their citizenship status and legal rights would be. A colony's specific status and designation could depend on a wide variety of factors. There were many different types and functions for a colony, so let's look at some of the main types the Romans used in order of precedence. First up were the full Roman citizen colonies, which were definitely the most prestigious type, as these settlers enjoyed full Roman citizenship and all of the rights that went along with it. This meant that settlers in a citizen colony had the right to participate in the political assemblies, and they had the legal protection of provocatio, which was basically the right to appeal a decision to a Roman magistrate. Additionally, they did not have to pay the main tax or tribute that non-citizen colonies had to pay to the government, although they did have to pay some lesser taxes to the main government and to the local colony. They were also generally exempt from a military levy. Basically, the settlers in a Roman citizen colony were able to enjoy all of the legal rights afforded to any other citizen living in Rome. However, because this status was definitely pretty sweet, considering you could get a free plot of land and full Roman citizenship, because of that, this type of colony was actually the most rare form used in the early Republic. This was mostly because of fierce competition among the aristocracy, where they did not want to hand out all of these great perks and benefits to people who might be able to grow powerful and challenge them later. However, by the time of the late Republic and the early Empire, full Roman citizen colonies were the most popular type of colony being established, which I'll touch on more in just a minute. Next were colonies designated as a municipality. A municipality had several tiers within itself, as the people in these colonies were regarded as being Roman, but they typically had varying degrees of citizenship and rights. A typical municipia, as it was called in Latin, had to pay taxes and supply men for Rome's armies, but they had the legal right of provocatio, and they could also vote in Rome's political assemblies, two things that only Roman citizens could typically do. So, they had the legal rights of a Roman, but they had to pay taxes and they could also be drafted into the army. But there was also the municipia sine suffragio, which means a municipality without the vote. And as this name suggests, these settlers did not have the right to provocatio or the right to vote, and they still had to pay taxes and were subject to the levy. For these settlers, the benefit of all of this was really only in the name, but it was a higher rung in the ladder that brought them closer to their pursuit of full citizenship. So it is a bit of confusing wordplay here from the Romans, but basically we have the municipality and the municipality without the vote. There were also veteran colonies, which could be set up by commanders as a reward for their soldiers after a great victory or for a lifelong career of service. This land might be settled by the veteran themselves to live on and farm, or they could sell it to give them money for some other venture. This practice attracted many Romans to the military, who were often seeking better financial opportunities than could otherwise be found in their small towns or in the streets of Rome. These colonies were typically given some form of citizenship, either partial or full, and the exact determination was ultimately decided upon by whoever was setting it up at the time. Along with these veteran colonies, the final type of colony that could have some form of citizenship were the maritime colonies, which were often established in locations far away from Rome to protect various points of the coast for sea trade. Now, these citizens were exempted from military service as an incentive, but because they were often far away and in unfriendly territory, it didn't really mean a whole lot to the people living there because they had to constantly remain on guard. Overall, the remote location of the maritime colonies made them very unpopular among the Romans, and only 10 were ever established throughout the entire history. After these were the varying types of non-Roman colonies, which were typically granted something called Latin citizenship, which held less rights compared to Roman citizenship. A modern comparison of this might be something like permanent residency. And these Latin citizen colonies were definitely the most common type established under the Republic, as the ruling aristocracy had no problem giving non-Romans large gifts of land. In fact, larger portions of land were usually granted to these Latin colonies as opposed to Roman colonies, and this meant a lot more people were willing to join these types of settlements. Our ancient sources even tell us of poor Romans giving up their Roman citizenship so they could go obtain some free land in a Latin colony. Once these settlers received this free land, they also became eligible for military service, because Rome had specific units made up of Latin allies, and so all of this really created a snowball effect where the Romans were able to give poor, jobless Romans free land to farm and create food, while also giving the Roman government a larger pool of manpower to draw upon for their military. As an example of the difference in numbers and popularity between the Roman and Latin colonies, we can see that from 338 to 218 BC, so a period of 120 years, Rome founded 10 Roman citizen colonies. But opposingly, the Romans founded 30 Latin colonies. So basically, 3 times as many Latin colonies were founded as were Roman colonies. So having gone over these different types of colonies and their general stratification, I'll say that these levels were not mutually exclusive. For example, although Latin colonies typically paid taxes and provided soldiers for the army, they could also be granted freedom from paying taxes for certain good behavior. This could happen if soldiers provided by a specific colony in war were noted for their bravery and valor in battle. That entire colony might receive a permanent relief from tax to the Roman government as a reward. This could also be granted for levying a larger amount of soldiers than was expected in a war, or even for paying a larger share of their taxes. So really, the various colonies could have different levels of rights and privileges based on their conduct in history, and we could say that each colony basically had a personal, unilateral relationship with the city of Rome. This wasn't only true for colonies, but it was really true for every town in the Roman Republican Empire. Every town and city could all progress through these same levels of rights and citizenship based on good behavior. So, when speaking of any Roman colony, town, or city, we might say there were different levels. The specifics of these were often so intermeshed that the reality is there were dozens of variations that could be seen with regards to rights and privileges that the people enjoyed in a town or colony. This was further mixed with a lot of what was going on in earlier Rome following the Treaty of Cassius in 493 BC, so all in all, things were very much intertwined and everything really depended on the individual situation at hand. The bottom line is, in theory, there were several set levels of colonies and towns within the Roman Republican Empire, but the reality on the ground meant that there were a lot of variations to be seen. Although colonies started out with strict military considerations in mind, this began to change over time. By the period of the late Republic, colonies started becoming a political tool, where prominent politicians began using them as a way to curry favor with the people and win popular support. And what better way to win a lot of votes than to hand out tons of free land? This started out with the establishment of veteran colonies under Sulla and Marius, who first used free land as an incentive to recruit men for their armies. However, these armies quickly became powerful political instruments, and other politicians began noticing that free land was a quick way to win clients and supporters. There's a lot to unpack from this period, which is something we'll definitely get into in our later podcast seasons, so for now, it's mostly important to point out that politicians in the late Republic began creating more and more full Roman citizen colonies that included larger pieces of land, so they could win the favor of the people who had the capacity to vote. Later, during the Empire, colonies were used heavily by the emperors as a way to appease the people and help secure their rule, and full Roman citizen colonies were the main form they used to do this. Often, emperors would name these colonies after themselves as a not-so-subtle way of reminding the people who it was that gave them all of these benefits. Additionally, I'll mention that under the emperors, it became common to give each settler 200 jugura, which is well over 100 modern acres. So, by this time, they were definitely handing out quite a bit of land. Now, there were quite a few methods the emperors used to maintain their power, but I think it's easy to see why so many Romans would have been happy to see the Republic fall if one of the main benefits they received was all of this free land. Now, given post-COVID house prices for so many places around the world, I think many people today can probably understand that. In the end, Roman colonies often symbolized what it meant to be a true Roman for many foreign people in the border regions. Throughout Rome's history, colonies provided for Rome's defense and gave a home to the poor and to veterans. Like the ripples cast from a stone into a pond, they spread Roman law, customs, commerce, language, and ideas around the Mediterranean. Although the empire would eventually decline, many towns which began as a Roman colony continued to thrive well into the medieval period, influencing the course of European history. The Roman colonies were not just mere settlements. They were the embodiment of a dream of a unified, prosperous, and enlightened Mediterranean, where people from diverse backgrounds could come together to build a brighter future. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at Retold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.